Welcome back to Demystify Sci. I'm Shiloh.
I'm Anastasia.
Today on the show, we have a very special guest, ourselves. We are tearing apart David Graeber's work, The Utopia of Rules, and trying to find some solutions to this strange orphaned feeling we have when we look out at the giant superstructures and political superstructures that control the minutiae of our daily lives, and imagining what comes next.
It's a conversation that is a part of something that we talk about all the time. Like, there's a weird feeling of alienation that has crept up on us, and it might partially be because we're not working as part of a larger corporation, and so we don't have a finger in the pie of traditional American success. But it also seems to be that it's a more universal feeling than that. Like, a lot of people over the course of the last 5 or 10 years are looking out onto the landscape of society and they're like, what is happening to people? How is that everything is so weird and not fulfilling its promise of a better, more satisfying life? Like, we have all of these creature comforts, we have all of these, we have cars, we have computers, we have every single piece of entertainment that you could possibly imagine. Like, why are people not satisfied? Why are people not happy? Why do we not live lives that are full of meaning in this kind of utopian vision that was popular in the early 1900s? And Graeber has a critique of it which starts from the bureaucratization of society. And he's like, look, we have bought into these massive superstructures that were once just for corporations. We have allowed them to take over the government, and we have allowed them to take over our own lives. And the book deals with what that means and how to actually be able to talk about something that is just the water in which we swim. Like, the world that we live in is so normal that every single one of us kind of takes for granted that this is how it's always been. Like, the lens of history is cloudy in this way, where it seems that there's no other possibility. And Graeber's like, I don't think that's true. I've studied enough history to know that it's not true. And I think that the only way that we can get out of it is by identifying the problem and then seeing what can actually be done about it.
That's right. And a huge part of that involves coming up with the language to critique it. He spends a good length pointing out that both the left wing and right wing critiques are either broken or insufficient or non existent. And so, how do we talk about this kind of thing? Because we've actually learned to behave and operate and talk as bureaucrats. And so, how can you critique bureaucracy when all of your tool set, all of your linguistic tools are bureaucratic in nature? It's very tricky. So we work our way through this essay and try to come up with what the problem really is and put it in sharp terms, which I think we accomplish, and then to consider a language that would work, which I think we come up with, and then we start to consider the solution set, which we have some half-baked ideas, but we'd love to hear your ideas in the comments section. Come over to Discord, hang out, and let's figure this out. There's probably people we should be talking to, and you guys might be able to help us figure out who they are. So, really, if you really want to get involved in this project, do come over and check out our Patreon community. It's really strong. We get together once a week and talk about these issues and talk about where to go from here in these investigations. It also helps us keep the lights on here, which what I mean is it gives us the time and space to do these investigations and put our attention towards them and not having to waste our time with bullshit jobs, as Graeber would say. So we could really use your help over there. If you want to support the podcast but don't have any money, you can just participate in the community, Discord, Facebook, comments section. You can tell someone about it, somebody who you think would benefit from this kind of discussion.
You can leave a rating at any of the podcast stores. That would help.
Maybe you need new clothes. We have some clothing line down below. We're not actually making money off it, but I'd point you towards it because it'd be really cool to rep Demystify Sci around your town and maybe get other people interested in the project. So all these things you can do to help us out, and we absolutely are eternally grateful to the people that are supporting us right now. It's one of the most beautiful things, especially for a podcast of this size. It's not this enormous Joe Rogan experience, but the amount of support we have relative to our size is really, I would have never thought that was possible before. I would have always thought you have to get, millions of subscribers to make it happen. And we're making it happen. We eat a lot of peanut butter, but we're making it happen. So thank you. And I would really love to see you join our community over there at patreon.com/demystifysci.
And in the meantime, enjoy the conversation. Tell us what you think in the comments, and we'll see you next time.
The scientific revolution starts now.
The Demystify Sci podcast.
Let us see in the dark.
What are we going to talk about today, DeLay?
Well, I started really down this rabbit hole before Biden jumped off the ticket because I felt like we were going into a year without an election. And I was feeling particularly politically orphaned in facing this next election cycle. I felt like I had nobody to vote for. Sort of still feel like I have nobody to vote for, but it seems like the country as a whole, also everybody I met felt like they had nobody to vote for. And I wondered how that came about and how we got in this position. And I wondered how it was that the left became the mainstream bureaucratic authority as well, because that's what orphaned me, right? I always considered myself a pretty strong leftist. Was always interested in stories of oppression from corporatism, from robber barons. I love Woody Guthrie coming at it from music, right? I loved that the idea of folk movements and workers' unions in the early days and all of the battles between the workers and the Richies, the slaughters, the Ludlow massacres, all of that, right? Very inspiring. And I've seen what can happen to a country when, let's say a countryside, when the labor force is disregarded, right? So I grew up in Ohio, and Ohio was a booming industrial hotbed before I was born. And there was all of these steel mill production, coal processing, a lot of work. And what's funny is when I was a kid, my parents would drag me on these miserable bike rides every weekend. They were really into bike trekking. And we would tour little towns all around Ohio, basically. You do these like 50-mile runs, and you loop through these, and you see the bombed out shells of what used to be. And you get that feeling that we sometimes get in the woods here, which is there used to be a civilization here, a really thriving civilization. I mean, what amounts to beautiful little towns, main streets, all like a theater that used to be there, the barbershop that used to be there, all this used to be. And so I think going into college and starting to read Chomsky and starting to read Zinn and listening to protest music. I was a huge Rage Against the Machine fan when I was a kid. I became exposed.
That guy writes for the New York Times now.
Zach De La Rocha?
No, the other guy.
Tom Morello,
Yeah.
guitar player. Right on. I mean, he's an interesting character. I think he went to Harvard or something. He's very intellectual. But anyways, I felt a lot of sympathy intuitively for workers who were being held down by the man. This might just be a teenager thing that everybody goes through to some extent. But what bummed me out in recent years, particularly since COVID, is I felt like there was no real, like not even a party, but a population of people that were concerned about oppression from a totalitarian regime that seemed to be emerging in our country.
I'm surprised you say that, because I feel like there was a really strong pushback against, let's say, what happened during COVID.
Oh, that's the funny part. It came from the right.
Yes.
That's the funny part.
Okay.
And so people, right, so because I wasn't jumping on the bandwagon from day one with a lot of the lockdown measures and the supposed remedies that, as a scientist, I perceived to be ineffective and hopeless, I began to suspect that there was a lot of money involved, really. And that's funny because it pushed me into, for people who are looking at me, like my friends and associates, family members, they started looking at me like I was using right-wing talking points all of a sudden. And that was really, really strange and alienating to me. And I guess all of this is preamble to say that when I found this book that we're going to be talking about today, it really helped me process what had happened to the left and potentially what it looks like to have a progressive movement going forward that actually does stand against corporate, bureaucratic oppression, but not in a traditional way.
Yeah, so the book that we're talking about is Graeber's Utopia of Rules. And so David Graeber is anthropologist, sociologist, kind of a little bit of everything. Writes a lot about history, economics, the organization of society. He's a diehard leftist. Like, he was at anti-globalization protests. He was fighting for traditionally left causes. And I think that he wrote this book because he realized that there was something weird that was happening to politics. So he died in 2020. He hasn't been around to see this like super big rise of tech censorship and all of the AI stuff. But even when he was writing this, I think that he published it in like 2015 or something. Like, it seems that he was starting, sorry, it was earlier. It was, the book was published in 2015, but the essays in it are from a little earlier, 2012.
Yeah, it's more a collection of essays than a book.
But he's basically looking around and he's like, this is really weird. The left doesn't really seem to have a leg to stand on. And he starts to piece through it. And as he pieces through it, he's like, I think that this is because we have become so bureaucratically captured that there is no ground to stand on to criticize anything anymore. And the left is so entwined with these bureaucratic measures and government and corporations that the only possible critique of the left comes from the right. The populist motion has gone to the right, and so all of these traditional left perspectives are now in a very different place in society.
The problem is that
changed.
he points out that the right does have the only extant critique, but it's ineffective.
Because he's basically like, okay, so what happens is that the right argues for deregulation, but deregulation doesn't actually produce a decrease in bureaucracy. What it does is it creates an increase in bureaucracy. Like, he has this really interesting point where I'm not actually going to find it right this second, but he's like, anytime that the right starts to criticize the system, they start to talk about the free market. But anytime that you start to talk about the free market, you have to be really careful to look around and see who's holding the gun, because the free market comes at the end of a long chain of violence, where in order to maintain what amounts to being a quote-unquote free market, there's a huge amount of bureaucratic, corporate, and governmental violence that hangs over the entire system because somebody has to enforce what amounts to being kind of unfair terms for a lot of different countries in this free market society. Because globalization isn't really about, making things better for the workers. It's not about allowing the workers to trade more easily. It's about allowing governments to exchange more easily.
Yeah, and any time that you deregulate things, you actually end up creating more jobs to enforce the somewhat less constrained environment. So there's a flood of clerks and paper processors who go into enforcing the contracts, which are just now broken up into, or there's less, let's say, agencies controlling it, but it still results in the same, if not more, amounts of people jumping on the ship to enforce those contracts.
Yeah, exactly.
He actually calls it I think it's the iron law of liberalism, which is something to the effect of any attempt at deregulation actually creates more paperwork, more bureaucracy, and more government jobs, essentially.
Yeah, he has this thing that he says, in contemporary American populism, and increasingly in the rest of the world as well, there can be only one alternative to bureaucracy, and that is the market. Sometimes this is held to mean that government should be run more like a business. Sometimes it is held to mean we should simply get the bureaucrats out of the way and let nature take its course, which means letting people attend to the business of their lives untrammeled by endless rules and regulations imposed on them from above, and so allowing the magic of the marketplace to provide its own solutions. Democracy thus came to mean the market. Bureaucracy, in turn, government interference with the market. And this is pretty much what the word continues to mean to this day. And he then goes on to say that, like, this isn't how it always was. Like, there was this moment in when the feudal system started to collapse where there was this great hope that what would happen is that this chain of functionaries and civil servants that were running the entire thing would go by the wayside, and that there actually would be liberty, the same way that we had freedom of thought as opposed to oppression of the church, that we would have freedom of organization as opposed to the oppression of these very stilted and ancient systems. And he's like, that didn't happen, because if you look at what happened after this liberalization, the system of bureaucrats became incredibly entrenched and rose alongside of democracy as being this other churning wheel that organizes the entire thing. And so there's not really an alternative, because the free market requires violence, bureaucracy requires bureaucrats, and democracy kind of tries to straddle the two but can never really find a comfortable place in which to operate.
Yeah, I think he's also pointing to the fact that the free market doesn't actually not require a bureaucracy. Like, there's this myth that's upheld. He points at Ludwig von Mises, and he's like, there's this myth that bureaucracy represents the enemy of democracy. But he's like, in reality, you still need somebody to administer the banks. You need somebody to enforce that the banks are actually paid, or that people are good on their loans. Like, you can't keep violence and enforcement, in other words, hiring of more government jobs, and thus the creation of bureaucracy, from happening. Like, and I think that's what's so difficult about this discussion that we're trying to have, and that he's trying to tee up for us, is that the solution doesn't seem to involve not having a bureaucracy, which is unfortunate, because it'd be really nice if it was just like, hey, we just need to get rid of this bureaucracy. And he's like, that's not possible, because by having laws, you have to have a court system. You have to have some penal system to enforce them. You have to have all of these different arms that make sure your civilization stays ordered, right? So it's actually impossible. Like, the idealistic idea of, well, we'll just shrink and get rid of the bureaucracy, well, that causes a lot of harm in the end.
And he also, I think, so it's really interesting reading this essay, because he seems to have a really hard time figuring out what it is that he's saying. Like, I've read it a couple of times now.
Yeah.
And even as I read it, there's these shifts in thought where he suddenly makes a point or he jumps subjects, and you can kind of see at the 30,000-foot view the point that he's trying to make, but it's kind of garbled.
Yeah.
It almost seems like it needed to go through a couple more rounds of revision to get all of the ideas out. But as far as I can tell, his point is that, like, look, we have seen a fusion of bureaucracy and finance and financialization and profits to such a degree that this is now just taken for granted that we live under a system whose entire purpose is to extract as much value as possible from us, and we have no way of criticizing it except for talking about something like
also just
deregulation.
Financialization in its own right doesn't actually create a good. It's a service that's sort of a pseudo service, right? Because a lot of financial transactions are just skimming off the top. And that's obviously the most well-paid portion of society, is the financial sector. Like, think about who are all the people filling the Manhattan high-rises, right? They're bankers. Mm-hmm. And then what's the most wealthy neighborhood in America? It's all of the lobbyists living around the DC area, right? Mm-hmm. So that's who is at the top of the pyramid right now. And the argument, that I'm making at least is that those aren't actually valuable pieces of the bureaucracy. They're just skimming off the top. But I think that the goal, in some sense, for Graeber and for us, is to devise a language for talking about the problem in such a way that a salient progressive critique can be developed. He's like, the left's been eaten by corporate bureaucracy, the right has an ineffective argument, and they misapprehend the problem in the first place. Therefore, we're orphans because we don't actually have a way of dealing with it. And at some point, I can't find the quote right now, but he says, it seems like the language for critiquing it has been intentionally obfuscated. The reason that the reason he can't get to the point, right? This is a 60-page introduction that warbles around the thesis, which turns out to be something like, man, wouldn't it be great if we could muster a salient critique of the standard bureaucracy in a fashion that worked for humans at the end of the day and not for the financial machine that just wants to extract and extract and extract without adding anything back to society. And so that's kind of our goal, I think, in this conversation, is to see if we can come up with a language for critiquing the bureaucratic authoritarian state.
Well, I've talked about this before, where I feel like the weirdest thing that happened in the last, 5 years or so, was the way that corporations managed to latch onto the idea of compassion as being the main driving force by which they organize their subjects. So if you take corporations to be the ones that are in charge of society, and he makes a decent argument for it, and I think that anybody who lives in society can also see that everything is bureaucratized, everything is corporatized. Like, he has this example where he calls the bank and he needs to get access to his accounts from abroad. And he's just stuck in this massive phone tree, talking to people, trying to figure out how to get access to his money. Nobody can help him. In the end, he doesn't get access to it. And he's like, if I had asked somebody why this was, they wouldn't lay the blame on the regulations of the bank. They would lay the blame on the government for having regulated the bank in a specific way that has created this molasses type of morass that's so difficult to move through. And we've become accustomed to the fact that everything is incredibly difficult. You, back in the 70s, if you wanted to apply for something, you might fill out a little bit of paperwork, you might make a phone call. It was like a very simple process by which you participated in society. And now credentialism and this ability to say that you have participated in the system is so entrenched and so massively important that you can't even get an entry-level job without a college degree. Any application is, tens of pages. You go online and applying for jobs is excruciating. Like, the people who have the just strong work ethic that's required to fill out the 200 job applications that are necessary to get a position at this point are incredible. And so we've created a society where, in order to participate in the basic principle of it, which is just to work, that's the most basic function, right?
Well, to follow rules really well, too. I think he makes the point that credentialism is largely about being able to check boxes, right?
Sure.
It's being able to show up at class, form a relationship with your professor that'll get you the grade that's necessary. Honestly, so much of succeeding in college is about having a relationship with your professor. So much of it, right? You have to do the work, true. But, the people who actually know how to participate and socialize in that bureaucratic structure are the ones that generally get lifted up. Like, if you think about the people, there's very few professorships available. But who are the people that we know from grad school who are able to elbow their way into that? They're the people who are participating in all the committees in grad school, the people who were already organizing, already forming relationships with the administration. They knew everybody in the office, right? It's like that. There's that bureaucratic culture that you have to be really good at to succeed in the world today, which
Yeah.
goes hand in hand with credentialism.
And so we've entered into a phase in society where it's not really a meritocracy in the sense of who has the greatest ideas or who has the greatest ability. In a lot of echelons, it's a bureaucracy.
And I just want to make one more point about the academic situation, which is the most obvious to us because we've been through it, been around it a lot.
Yeah.
If you look, there's a twofold phenomenon that happens with professors. They get into their professorship finally by checking all the boxes and really doing all of the bureaucratic committee work and everything. And then they find out that most of their job comes down to being an administrator. And then they think, what the hell? I came here to do science. But the fact of the matter is the system didn't select them to do science. It selected them because they're really good administrators. So they are the best administrators at the end of the day. And they're there because they're the best administrators. And so when you see these headlines like science innovation has really fallen off a cliff in the last 30, 50 years, it shouldn't be much of a surprise because it goes hand in hand with the bureaucratization and the administrative box-checking reward structure that's been put in place in academia.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And he really does link it to this idea of financialization. So he midway through the chapter he says, this process, the gradual fusion of public and private power into a single entity, rife with rules and regulations whose ultimate purpose is to extract wealth in the form of profits, does not yet have a name. That in itself is significant. These things can happen largely because we lack a way to talk about them. But one can see its effect in every aspect of our lives. It fills our day with paperwork. Application forms get longer and more elaborate. Ordinary documents like bills or tickets or memberships in sports or book clubs come to be buttressed by pages of legalistic fine print. I'm going to call this the age of total bureaucratization. It had its first stirrings, one might say, just at the point where public discussion of bureaucracy began to fall off in the late 70s. And it began to get seriously underway in the 80s, but it truly took off in the 90s. In an earlier book, I suggested that the fundamental historical break that ushered in our current economic regime occurred in 1971, the date that the US dollar went off the gold standard. This is what paved the way for the first financialization of capitalism, but ultimately for much more profound, long-term changes that I suspect will ultimately spell the end of capitalism entirely. I still think that. But here we are speaking much more of short-term effects.
It's weird he breezes over that line too, because he never really develops it. It's like,
I think it's in the other chapter.
I suspect this will be... No, I don't think the other chapters are in any way pegged to this intro essay. I really don't.
He says in the essay, he's like, I'll deal with this more in the other chapters.
All right. I didn't get to that one, I guess.
So he's like, it's going to spell the end of capitalism entirely. We're speaking here of much more short-term effects. What did financialization mean for the deeply bureaucratized society that was post-war America? I think what happened is best considered as a kind of shift in class allegiances on the part of the managerial staff of major corporations, from an uneasy de facto alliance with their own workers to one with investors. As John Kenneth Galbraith pointed out long ago, if you create an organization geared to produce perfumes, dairy products, or aircraft fuselages, those who make it up will, if left to their own devices, tend to concentrate their efforts on producing more and better perfumes, dairy product, or aircraft fuselages, rather than thinking primarily of what will make the most money for shareholders. What's more, since for most of the 20th century, a job in a large bureaucratic megafirm meant a lifetime promise of employment, everyone involved in the process, managers and workers alike, tended to see themselves as sharing a certain common interest in this regard, over and against meddling owners and investors. This kind of solidarity across class lines even had a name. It's called corporatism. One mustn't romanticize it. It was, among other things, the philosophical basis of fascism, which is something you talk about a lot, the corporatism and the fascism and how these things link together. Indeed, one could argue that fascism simply took the idea that workers and managers had common interests, that organizations like corporations or communities formed organic wholes, and that financiers were an alien parasitical force and drove them to their ultimate murderous extreme. Even in its more benign social democratic versions, in Europe or America, the attendant politics often came tinged with chauvinism, but they ensured also that the investor class was always seen to some extent, as outsiders, against whom white-collar and blue-collar workers could be considered, at least to some degree, be united in a common front.
At the beginning of that, he says that the financialization began, like all this changed in 1971. How does it change? Do you have a sense of what causes that? Like, why is it that all of a sudden the corporations turn towards the shareholders because they still had investors, presumably originally. The owners and investors were still there.
I think that in 1971, the stock market became the place where people put their money, much more than they did beforehand.
Got it. That makes perfect sense.
And so I think that there is this thing that we've talked about this
because it's the only way that you hold value with your bank account, essentially.
Right. Like at some point, I imagine that prior to 1971, there's probably a lot more people that held gold or kept their money in their mattress. But now you're off the gold standard. And in order to make sure that your money doesn't deflate, you have to put it somewhere. Like you can't just hold on to it anymore.
So everyone becomes an investor, essentially.
Yes. And so this is the crux of the financialization of society, where instead of there being a class of the financiers and then a class of the workers and then maybe a class of owners, now all of the workers are deeply invested in the financial markets. And so it's impossible to criticize because you have a portfolio and you need Google and Pfizer and Shell and all of these companies that, you know, when you stop and you look around, you're like, oh my God, they're destroying the world. They're destroying us. But then on the other hand, you're like, but my pension. My
501k, my index funds.
401k.
401k. You can tell I don't have one.
Yeah, exactly.
That's so fascinating.
Yeah, and so he's basically like, what happened in the 70s and what paved the way for what we see today was a strategic pivot of the upper echelons of U.S. corporate bureaucracy, away from the workers and towards shareholders, and eventually towards the financial structure as a whole. Corporate management became more financialized, but at the same time, the financial sector became corporatized, with investment banks, hedge funds, and the like largely replacing individual investors. As a result, the investor class and the executive class became almost indistinguishable.
He also says free trade and the free market actually meant the creation of global administrative structures mainly aimed at ensuring the extraction of profits for investors, and that globalization really meant bureaucratization.
Yeah, everything just basically falls into place and everybody becomes this little lever in the machine, and you do the work and you're rewarded for the work, and it's really a system that you can't criticize, because if you criticize it, it'll fall apart. Like if you're a lumberjack and you're criticizing the corporation that employs you, you still maintain the ability to be a lumberjack. Like these people can organize and, you know, to look at it from a socialist perspective, like seize the means of production. But we talked about this previously somewhere else, where it's like, you can't really replace Google. If you're working as a unit inside the bureaucracy of this massive corporation, the corporation itself actually can't rebuild itself. Like we were talking about circular dependencies inside of Google, where the way that search is organized right now is that there's so many layers that have been built where if the entire structure gets wiped out, they can't reboot it. Like there's, if you have some baseline level of search, like let's say it's a pyramid, so like level 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, they have that level 1 supports level 2, and then level 2 supports level 3.
And literally no one knows how level 1 works anymore.
No, I think that they do, but the problem that happens is that level 3 now has pieces written into it that depend back on level 1, and then also depend on levels above it. And so because you have these circular dependencies, if the entire system comes crashing down, it's not like you can linearly rebuild it, because the way that it works right now is so interconnected that it's not a...
I thought there was this element that the people who worked on level 1 are gone.
That's true too.
And so like you'd have to start all over, basically.
Well, there was, and you can't really start all over. Like I remember this was a thing when Musk bought Twitter, and his first thought was, he was like, we're gonna recode this entire thing from scratch. And it very quickly became apparent that that's not possible. When you have a system that is that complex with so many users, you can't. it's just the most that you can do is you can iterate pieces of the code, because if you start to just take entire chunks out, you really quickly discover that there is this lack of information, like you're saying, about what each piece does. And that's really wild.
Yeah, I remember in grad school just getting, pieces of code from people for different data processing and then trying to make sense of what the heck was going on inside. Or even taking, one of Peter's Blender files and trying to, I actually know how to work Blender pretty well, and I could not make heads or tails of what the heck was going on. So it is really interesting inheriting different infrastructures.
Yeah, and so this is the problem of challenging a mind first bureaucratic organization, which is that you can see that it's useful, and you can also see that it can't be rebuilt just from scratch. And so you're kind of like, well, this is just how it is now. Like, this is what we're stuck with. And he makes this point that the language of these organizations has so deeply filtered into society that we have no way around it. Like, he points to stuff like, words like stakeholder, vision, quality, leadership, excellence, innovation, strategic goals, best practices. Like, these are deeply bureaucratic terms which have now filtered back into society, where all kinds of self-actualization movements are using this exact same language for referring to the people themselves as opposed to the bureaucratic process. And so in some ways, each of us becomes this bureaucratic functionary in our own lives because of the language that is used to talk about what it means to live a good life. It's all the way down to the very bottom. And so it's a single whole piece. It's really crazy, where he points repeatedly to this idea that we bought into the fantasy that a government operates like a corporation in its best form, and that it seems to have trickled down to the individual, which is that the individual's life is also best lived by the same rules that operate inside of a bureaucratic corporation.
Which is funny because from a purely ledger-based standpoint, that's absolutely true. Like, everybody, if they knew what was good for them, would turn themselves into a corporation and operate that way.
And this is like mimetic spread, right? Like, clearly it worked for people, right? He
Just by tax laws alone.
By tax laws?
Just like if you wanted to maximize your losses due to taxes, you would operate as a corporation.
Maximize your losses.
Or sorry, minimize your losses.
Oh, yeah.
I'm sorry.
Sorry.
Yeah. Maximize your returns, minimize your losses.
Yeah.
You would turn into a corporation because they get better breaks on taxes.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and so he talks a lot about like credentialism and the way that these ideas spread. And go ahead.
I'm not sure how deep you are into this, but did I say okay? Yeah, he does start to work his way towards the global justice movement, which he sees as being anything approximating a proper attempt at rebelling against this structure. But are you there yet? Do you want to wait on that?
Let's see. There was. I want to read a piece that he has on the way that debt operates in this financial economy, where he talks about, the fact that in order to become a mechanic or a journalist or a pharmacist or anything else, you have to take on these massive debt structures. And he's like, the lenders legislate themselves a cut of these people's subsequent incomes. They sponsor their training, and then they're like, in return for the training, you will pay me interest on what I have given you.
So the lenders love college debts. They love credentialism debts, med school, dental school. And he makes the claim that they actually lobby on behalf of these different credentials so that you need a new certificate for every, sometimes it's funny, you go to like the health clinic or something, and these people have like 30, I mean, that's an exaggeration, but they have several letters after their name, right?
Mm-hmm.
And each one of those represents essentially a traded guild that they have had to pay their way through. And honestly, it's like, it's hard to totally critique it, because on some level you're like, I don't know if it's true or not, but you feel, I mean, I've lost a lot of faith in medical credentialism and academic credentialism, but at some sense, the John Q public feels reassured, because they're like, okay, at least this guy's been through medical school, and medical school makes people good doctors, right? And if you didn't have any credentials, you'd just be like going on reputation, right? Hey, this guy's a good doctor. My cousin Joey says he, glued my leg back together. It feels great. And that's all you would have.
And I think that on some level, training is good. You want people to be trained. I've always wondered why it's not possible for people to be trained like on the job. But actually, I think that
But aside from this, the financialization seems to be like this insidious fang claw in the side of credentialism. I don't think the credentialism itself is as dangerous as the fact that but entities are extracting wealth off of the credentialism and therefore reinforcing its proliferation.
In terms of the credentialism, he says that increasingly corporate profits in America are not derived from commerce or industry at all, but from finance, which means ultimately from other people's debts. These debts do not just happen by accident. To a large degree, they are engineered, and precisely by this kind of fusion of public and private power. The corporatization of education, the resulting ballooning of tuitions as students are expected to pay for giant football stadiums and similar pet project of executive trustees, or to contribute to the burgeoning salaries of ever-multiplying university officials. The increasing demands for degrees as certificates of entry into any job that promises access to anything like a middle-class standard of living, resulting rising levels of indebtedness, all of these form a single web. One result of this debt is to render the government itself the main mechanism for the extraction of corporate profits. Just think of what happens if one tries to default on one's student loans. The entire legal apparatus leaps into action, threatening to seize assets, garnish wages, and apply thousands of dollars in additional penalties. Another is to force the debtors themselves to bureaucratize ever-increasing dimensions of their own lives, which have to be managed as if they were themselves a tiny corporation measuring inputs and outputs and constantly struggling to balance its accounts. And so it's exactly that. Like, the system is set up in such a way where we suffer the weight of financialization constantly.
We're the prisoners and the prison guards.
Yeah, because I mean, anybody who was invested in 2008 in a pension fund or whatever else was also invested in these subprime mortgages. The system is so obscure and complex and necessary because of the way that inflation just takes chunks out of people's savings that you have to participate. And in the absence of participation, you're kind of screwed. And because everybody participates, we're all reluctant to challenge the system. Like, we've had so many conversations about financialization of these things, and it always comes down to like, well, if you change any of this, you're going to wipe out people's savings. You're going to wipe out people's ability to survive in retirement. You're going to wipe out their ability to live decent lives that aren't just living in a sod hut on the prairie.
I mean, we can talk about potential solution sets in a minute.
Okay.
Because I do think that there's some possibilities. I don't think that we have to continue to live in an ever-increasing financialized oligarchy situation where honestly, I would say these non-human entities, like these parasitic entities, seem to dominate the landscape and we're all complicit in them. I don't think that it has to, or that it's not really sustainable. It's going to become oppressive to the point of revolution eventually. So the question is, how do we avoid that? And I think there are some solutions we can toy with at the end here, but let's make it through his queue up first.
Yeah, let's do it.
I mean, to get us in that direction, he points at, okay, so we've made it to this point. The left has been absorbed into this corporate bureaucracy. Honestly, mainstream right has too, but mainstream right is always whining about deregulation. Problem is, deregulation actually increases the bureaucracy at the end of the day. Even Mises admits this. He quotes him at some point. So what is there? And he points at one particular protest movement that he thinks did actually have some traction for a second. And obviously, it didn't work out in the end, but he thinks that perhaps we can learn some lessons from the global justice movement in terms of how to go about standing up against this inevitable totalitarianism that's going to happen, is happening, and will continue to escalate if we don't do anything about it. So he's got 3 main bullet points that he says are lessons learned from the global justice movement. And just in terms of people, if you don't know what the global justice movement was, there was this moment, when did this happen? I want to say when I was in college, maybe even earlier, where people converged on
the G8 protests?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
It was, they converged on Seattle,
mm-hmm.
and they were standing up against these global financial superstructures that seem to be shaping policies around the world.
Yeah, he's talking about November 1999.
99, okay, so right before I went to college. And I remember just seeing all these protesters on the news. It was the first time most people in America had ever even heard of things like these World Bank organizations. It was the first time this came to light. I think that's part of the reason why he thinks it was a valuable movement, is because it did bring attention to these financial superstructures that wouldn't have been there otherwise. Anyways, he has 3 main bullet points. One is that don't underestimate the importance of sheer physical violence. 2 is something to the effect of technology isn't necessarily the problem. In other words, technology isn't a causative factor. Often it's how the technology is used. And 3 is to remember that it's ultimately all about values. So, a lot of critiques focus on saying that the other camp is irrational and stupid and idiots and doesn't understand how things work. And he's saying, no, everybody understands how things work. They just want different things. So when you organize a protest movement, when you organize a critique of some standard system of operation, a government, let's say, you have to be careful not to be demeaning and actually work with the understanding that people want different things.
Mm-hmm.
So
I'm really amused, though, in this section where he's got these 3 bullet points. It's the same thing that happens throughout the entire essay, where it's so disjointed.
Yeah.
Right? Like in the section where he's like, do not underestimate the importance of sheer physical violence. It sounds like what he's advocating for when you read that statement is that he's going to advocate for violence on the part of the protesters. But in fact, what he's trying to say is he's like, you need to expose the violence inherent in the system. And peaceful protest is the best way to do that.
It's very Gandhian, right?
Mm-hmm.
He's very much saying, look, those guys out in Seattle got on the news getting beat up by cops.
He was there.
Sure. But that was a bad look for the WTO or the G8. Who was actually there? I don't even know.
It was the IMF, it was the WTO, the World Bank, and all the G8 countries.
Right, so basically all these...
As well as NAFTA and the EU.
All these super powerful, rich financiers and global leaders support, in cahoots with them. It was the most obvious display of this new superstructure that had emerged in the last 30, 50 years in direct, violent abuse of people who are standing against it. And, if you go back to the whole history of nonviolent activism, it's all about getting your ass kicked and showing the brutality of the regime that you're opposing. Because at some point, even the individual, the Gandhi's point with all that is like, look, people are human beings at the end of the day. And even though they might be indoctrinated or be getting kickbacks and rewarded for participating in a bureaucracy, at the point of the actual conflict, when they're down on the street and they're forced to swing a club at somebody, at some point they just get so disgusted with the violence that they're perpetrating that they start to lose faith in that totalitarian regime. And once that happens, you're winning. Once the people who are actually holding the guns have given up on their commanders, let's say, that's when you actually have change occur. And it hurts because you got to get your ass kicked.
What's interesting, though, is that I feel like if you apply this to the last few years, the violence inherent in the system has become less apparent. Like, I think that the system is less prone to use violence. Like Waco, Ruby Ridge, the G8 protests, the protests at the Democratic National Convention. Like, these are all different iterations of the same thing where the government shows its ass, where it shows that it is actually willing to turn its guns on people that are ostensibly either nonviolent or have not yet committed violence. And I think that it was very embarrassing for them. And we still see this in terms of police brutality.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say.
And
that's the one, I love that point. I just want to slip it in that he makes. I think he makes it. I believe this is his point. That what's the thing that gets you in the most trouble with the cops?
Resisting arrest.
That's it. It's like, do the cops beat the hell out of burglars and robbers and stuff? Not usually. Like, if they catch them, they just, arrest them and that's it. But if you get pulled over for a traffic stop and start giving lip to the cop, you could find yourself getting tased in no time. Mm-hmm. If he's like, get out of the car, and you're like, no, I'm not getting out of the car. Like, it's literally the worst thing you can do in a bureaucratic state is in any way oppose the authority structure.
Mm-hmm. But I'm like, I think that the authority structure is starting to see that. And I think that because Graeber's writing this before social media really takes off, it's a critique that has become almost out of date, because I'm like, yeah, there are still people that are going to protests. And yes, there's footage from the protests of cops tasing them and pepper spraying them, even when they're being peaceful. But that seems to be less prevalent. It feels like the sphere of control has shifted to this online space where it's allowing people to maintain all of this discourse online and on the social media platforms as opposed to actually going out into the streets. It's
and
like
very carefully curating that discourse.
Yeah, exactly.
So I don't know if using the word violence is quite appropriate in this case, but there's a lot of combat against ideas by the bureaucratic administrative super intelligences and all of this, right? They're definitely very good. What's amazing is that, the internet was supposed to be this free exchange. Everybody's going to have a website and we'll all have all these ideas and the best ones will rise to the top. But they've done a really good job centralizing information, right? Google's what everybody uses. YouTube's what everybody uses. Wikipedia's what everybody uses. And so you've recreated the 3 channels on the TV that I had when I was a kid, essentially.
Sure, yeah.
And it's easy to control it when you only have a few channels.
Yeah, exactly.
So...
But I'm just like, I think that he's right that when you can expose the violence, it becomes really obvious. But violence is a, basal brain reaction that everybody can look at and be repulsed by, and everybody can see the brutality of it, and the contrast between a peaceful protester and a violent cop is really easy to see. But when you start to get into the realm of information, this all starts to become much more nebulous, because you can make the case that, having people advocating for, genocide of minorities or whatever else is a bad idea. And so the idea of policing information becomes much more appealing to people than the idea of policing protesters. Like it's almost universal that when you see peaceful protesters being attacked, the people attacking them are reviled. But when you see information being policed, it's
We don't
not.
see it.
That's the thing.
You
Yeah,
don't see it. It's
you
out of
just see the
sight, out of
after
mind.
effect of it.
It's almost like the G8 people read this handbook and
Mm-hmm.
they were like, oh, yeah, we should probably find a better way of doing this.
Yeah, exactly.
So the next point that he makes is that we shouldn't overestimate the importance of technology as a causative factor.
Mm-hmm.
So when we start blaming these social media companies or blaming the proliferation of bad information and all of this, that's missing the points a little bit. I mean, I like the ATM anecdote he gives here.
Yeah, it's fantastic. You want to read it?
Sure. I'm just trying to figure out where to start here. I mean, the basic overview is that we have no problem making machines that work really, really well. The real question is, which machines do we focus on that work really, really well? So there was this, there's always voter fraud problems, right? And people are like, and the government's like, well, our voting machines have, some inherent error in them. Let's say, I think a couple of % or something, right?
Mm-hmm.
Which is really funny because a couple of % in an election can make all the difference in the world. And so how is it, like, is that really the limits of the technology that we have right now? And he's like, no, consider the ATM machine. In the last 30 years, I can't remember a single occasion in which I've asked an ATM machine for money and gotten the incorrect amount. Nor have I been able to find anyone I know who can. This is so true that in the wake of the 2000 US presidential elections, when the public was being regaled with statistics on the 2.8% degree of error expected from this type of voting machine, or the 1.5% expected from that, some had the temerity to point out that in a country that defines itself as the world's greatest democracy, where elections are our very sacrament, we seem to just accept that voting machines will regularly miscount the vote, while every day hundreds of millions of ATM transactions take place with an overall 0% error rate. What does this say about what really matters to Americans as a nation? I'm going to keep reading because this next paragraph kills too. Financial technology then has gone from a running gag to something so reliable that it can form the assumed backbone of our social reality. You never have to think about whether the cash machine will dispense the correct amount of cash. If it's working at all, it will not make a mistake. This gives financial abstractions an air of utter certainty, a ready-to-hand quality, as Martin Heidegger put it. Such an essential part of the practical infrastructure of our daily projects and affairs that we never have to think about it as something in itself at all. Meanwhile, physical infrastructure like roads, escalators, bridges, and underground railways crumble all around us, and the landscape surrounding major cities is peppered with futuristic visions of past generations now lying smelly, dirty, or abandoned. None of this just happened. It is precisely a matter of national priorities. The results of policy decisions that allocate funding for everything from landmark preservation to certain kinds of scientific research. This is the world that all those endless documents about vision, quality, leadership, and innovation have actually produced. Rather than causing our current situation, the direction that technological change has taken is itself largely a function of the power of finance.
Yeah, I love that. And I never thought about it that way before, where we can make a machine that does what we want. And so as we're watching these machines that we all live inside of, and we're like, oh, well, we can't figure out how to make them do what we want to create a society where people aren't just tearing each other to pieces. It's like, it seems much more plausible that the technology is aimed at creating a society that tears itself to pieces because it helps the financial markets. And so it's like any critique that focuses on abandoning technology is missing the point, because technology is inherently a beautiful, magical thing that makes life better. Like, I think about this every single time I run the vacuum, where I run the washing machine, or we
Every night when I
drive
cook
somewhere. Every night when you cook
the
dinner.
refrigerator,
Yeah, it's like, these are things.
especially when the power goes out. That's when I really think about it.
Or about the fact that I have like every book on demand inside of this little device, right? Like,
Right.
we live in the greatest possible time when it comes to technology. Our lives should be so utopian, and yet the machines that are being made for us are not being made to improve our lives alone. They're being made to subtly drive us into the decisions that these systems want us to make, and those decisions are what's bad for us.
They're bad for us because they don't enrich us. They enrich some third party.
Yeah.
And that third party has completely innervated the governments at this point. And it's hard to treat it as people even. I mean, obviously there's actors involved in the finance side of things, but it's really systematic because, like you said at the beginning, we're all complicit in it in so much as we participate in the stock market in any way, shape, or form. And yeah, you kind of have to if you don't want to lose your savings.
Yeah.
I mean, it'd be great if I knew a guy who was starting a business that I could invest in, right? But it's like,
But that's the thing. You'd have to spend a lot of time doing your due diligence, figuring out if this person was trustworthy, how much money you wanted to
and
invest,
how many,
who's
how
going
could
to
I hedge
enforce
my
that
bets?
contract,
Yeah.
how would you hedge your bets, and if you
How
give
many
it
people could actually do that for?
right, and so it's like the system works really, really well for.
Busy bureaucrat workers.
I wonder if there's something about busyness that's inherent in the bureaucratic mindset too.
Seems like it. I mean, I still have nightmares about this, but one of my experiences of working in, like before I went to grad school and I was just working in labs, it's just hilarious. I'm sure everybody who's worked in an office has experienced this, where you have to look busy when the boss comes around.
Oh yeah.
And that's really funny because it's not like the boss is making sure you got your work done, although that happens too. But I had this really funny guy, a postdoc who came into our lab at some point, and he would work in the middle of the night only. He was a bit of a vampire. But, one day the boss didn't like this, and our boss was a surgeon, so he was on a different campus. He'd only come by randomly, like he'd just pop into the lab on the other side of town every once in a while. And he came in, and this postdoc was never, ever there. Worked in the middle of the night. And one day they had an open conflict about this. And it was really, really, it's really interesting to see a managerial type have this bureaucratic conflict with someone. I've had it before, a different anecdote I can tell at Starbucks when I used to work there. But he had this open conflict in the lab, and he was like, hey man, you need to be here during the day. It doesn't look good. And the postdoc was like, hey dude, I'm the only one who's gotten anything done this last year in the lab. I've got a paper ready for publication. I'm developing this new pharmaceutical product, planning my own startup. I've actually cut you in on my startup. Like, shut the hell up. Leave me alone. And boss honestly just kind of ate it. He was didn't have anything to really say. He was just kind of like, I remember him just being silent, and the postdoc walked away. And it's just a really interesting point, because when you're in those environments, you get your work done, but you have to be there for 8 hours a day or whatever it is. You need to be in that seat. The appearance of busyness is really important, right, for keeping that dream alive. And so everybody who's in their lab base or whatever, they'll be, just doing their personal business, reading the news, or hanging out on Facebook or whatever it is. But as soon as the boss comes around, everybody just like clears it and breaks out spreadsheets and acts like, they're toiling away. But it doesn't really change anything about the output at the end of the day.
Yeah. I'd tie this back to technology.
Oh, I was moving on from that, but.
So tie it to the next.
So the next section is about values and about critiques. And I think in some sense, that's what it came down to, was that in that case with the postdoc, that his boss was kind of saying, our boss was kind of saying, this is, you can't do this. It looks bad. You have to be here during the day. And the critique that was firing back was like, that doesn't make any sense. It's irrational, right? Like, you're like, hey boss, you're being irrational. I'm getting a lot of work done. You should leave me alone to do what I want. The fact of the matter was that the postdoc didn't understand that the boss's primary value wasn't on him getting a lot of work done.
Right. It was appearances.
And so Graeber's third point is that you have to understand what's being valued in any situation, not whether it's rational or not, because everybody has a different rationale. It just breaks down across people's values, which is something we've come into before. And I think that's absolutely true. I mean, how often, like, we've had people on the podcast who are like, you know, say they're on one side of a political divide. They're like, yeah, I've sat down with blankers, you know, whether either side, and they're like, and I've explained this to them, and they've agreed with my reasoning, but they still refuse to go along with it. Like, they won't. I've never changed anyone's mind. I think that was that guy, the Texan historian. He was like, yeah, I've explained this to the opposition many times, but I've never once in my career changed anyone's mind. And I'm like, that's because people are not operating based on rationality and logic. They're operating on a sense of what they value. And in the bureaucratic state of the laboratory with the postdoc, what's valued is having a lab that looks like it's functioning. That's what makes him, the boss, look good to his peers. Yeah, there's going to be some steady stream of, you know, somewhat insignificant papers coming out. Everybody's doing that. Nobody's getting Nature papers in any of these labs around us, right? It's, does it look right? Does it look good? And
Yeah. And I mean, he has a couple of really interesting things in here. He starts the section by saying that the self-actualization philosophy, from which most of this new bureaucratic language emerged, insists that we live in a timeless present, that history means nothing, that we simply create the world around us through the power of the will. This is a kind of individualistic fascism. Around the time that this philosophy became popular in the 70s, some conservative Christian theologians were actually thinking along very similar lines, seeing electronic money as a kind of extension for God's creative power, which is then transformed into material reality through the minds of inspired entrepreneurs. It's easy to see how this could lead to the creation of a world where financial abstractions feel like the very bedrock of reality, and so many of our lived environments look like they were 3D printed from somebody's computer screen. In fact, the sense of a digitally generated world I've been describing could be taken as a perfect illustration of another social law. At least, it seems to me that it should be recognized as a law. That if one gives sufficient social power to a class of people, holding even the most outlandish ideas, they will, consciously or not, eventually contrive to produce a world organized in such a way that living in it will, in 1,000 subtle ways, reinforce the impression that those ideas are self-evidently true.
I love that.
And so it's like, he goes on, and this is tied into this idea of values, which is that once you have created a society where financialization of the economy and of people is the highest value, we all operate within it as if, well, obviously this is what you're going to do. And he points to America as being the originator and distributor of this notion throughout the entire world. Where he, earlier in a section, he's like, you know, it's really weird because after World War II, when the British Empire started to decline, there was this momentary question of who would rise. Would Germany rise to power, or would America rise to power as the one who went out to define the world from there on out? And obviously America won that contest. And he's like, it's really weird what they did with that power, which is that they created these massive worldwide bureaucracies with that ability. And nobody had done that before. But it was America that went through and was like, okay, we're going to organize all of these nations into these alliances. These alliances will administer trade, and they will administer politics, and they will administer wars. And this is the American legacy. It's the increasing bureaucratization, the increasing financialization to the degree that our primary value that cannot be questioned is becoming richer and is becoming more efficient. And he talks about this idea of the way that this is tied into the notion of rationality.
Yes.
Which is like...
Maybe we read a little piece of that because that's really good.
Yeah, so One thing that the global justice movement taught us is that politics is indeed ultimately about value, but also that those creating vast bureaucratic systems will almost never admit what their values really are. This was as true of the Carnegies as it is today. Normally they will, like the robber barons of the turn of the last century, insist that they are acting in the name of efficiency or rationality. But in fact, this language always turns out to be intentionally vague, even nonsensical. The term rationality is an excellent case in point here. A rational person is someone who is able to make basic logical connections and assess reality in a non-delusional fashion. In other words, someone who isn't crazy. Anyone who claims to base their politics on rationality, and this is true on the left as well as on the right, is claiming that anyone who disagrees with them might as well be insane, which is about as arrogant a position as one could possibly take. Or else they're using rationality as a synonym for technical efficiency, and thus focusing on how they're going about something because they do not wish to talk about what it is they are ultimately going on about.
And that's what was happening in my lab, as far as I can tell. Because the reason the appearances were so important is that my boss depended on the neighboring labs to support his grant applications. He was in some fast-track young PI thing, and we had a very well-established, famous lab next door to us. And that lab PI was integral to him getting on to the next point in his bureaucratic position along the hierarchy. But he wasn't willing to say that, right? That's not the story. The story is that it's irrational not to be there during the day.
Well, it sounds like he did say that. It sounds like he said that it doesn't look good.
He didn't come out and say it,
I
but
see.
I mean, maybe he did. Maybe he did come out and say it, but he didn't say look good for who and for why and for what end, right? Because the postdoc's also coming at it from a rational perspective, and he's like, look, I'm getting more science done. And Boss doesn't have the gumption to say, well, getting science done isn't exactly what we do here.
When he's like the Graeber, I highlighted this like really long section towards the end, which I don't know. It's like 4 or 5 paragraphs. Can I read it? It's so good.
Yeah, of course.
Okay. For anyone who has ever been a refugee, or for that matter had to fill out the 40-page application required to get one's daughter considered for admission by a London music school, the idea that bureaucracy has anything to do with rationality, let alone efficiency, might seem odd. But this is the way it looks from the top. In fact, from inside the system, the algorithms and mathematical formulae by which the world comes to be assessed become, ultimately, not just measures of value, but the source of value itself. Much of what bureaucrats do, after all, is evaluate things. They're continually assessing, auditing, measuring, weighing the relative merits of different plans, proposals, applications, courses of action, or candidates for promotion. Market reforms only reinforce this tendency. This happens on every level. It is felt most cruelly by the poor, who are constantly monitored by an intrusive army of moralistic box tickers, assessing their child-rearing skills, inspecting their food cabinets to see if they are really cohabiting with their partners, determining whether they have been trying hard enough to find a job, or whether their medical conditions are really sufficiently severe to disqualify them from physical labor. All rich countries now employ legions of functionaries whose primary function is to make poor people feel bad about themselves. But the culture of evaluation is, if anything, even more pervasive in the hyper-credentialized world of the professional classes, where audit culture reigns, and nothing is real that cannot be quantified, tabulated, or entered into some interface or quarterly report. Not only is this world ultimately a product of financialization, it's really just a continuation of it. Since what is the world of securitized derivatives, collateralized debt obligations, and other such exotic financial instruments, but the apotheosis of the principle that value is ultimately a product of paperwork, and the very apex of a mountain of assessment forms, which begins with the irritating caseworker determining whether you are really poor enough to merit a fee waiver for your children's medicine, and ends with men in suits engaged in high-speed trading of bets over how long it will take you to default on your mortgage. A critique of bureaucracy fit for the times would have to show how all these threads, financialization, violence, technology, and the fusion of public-private knit together into a single self-sustaining web.
That's our job.
The process of financialization has meant that an ever-increasing proportion of corporate profits come in the form of rent extraction of one sort or another.
Michael Hudson.
Since this is ultimately little more than legalized extortion, it is accompanied by ever-increasing accumulation of rules and regulations, and ever more sophisticated and omnipresent threats of physical force to enforce them. Indeed, they become so omnipresent that we no longer realize we're being threatened, since we cannot imagine what it would be like not to be. At the same time, some of the profits from rent extraction are recycled to select portions of the professional classes, or to create new cadres of paper-pushing corporate bureaucrats. This helps a phenomenon I have written about elsewhere, the continual growth, in recent decades, of apparently meaningless make-work bullshit jobs. Strategic vision coordinators, human resource consultants, legal analysts, and the like, despite the fact that even those who hold such positions are half the time secretly convinced they contribute nothing to the enterprise. In the end, this is just an extension of the basic logic of class realignment that began in the 70s and 80s as corporate bureaucracies become extensions of the financial system. Every now and then, you chance on a particular example that brings everything together. In September 2013, I visited a tea factory outside Marseille that was currently being occupied by its workers. There had been a standoff with the local police for over a year. What had brought things to such a pass? A middle-aged factory worker, who took me on a tour of the plant, explained that while ostensibly the issue was a decision to move the plant to Poland to take advantage of cheaper labor, the ultimate issue had to do with the allocation of profits. The oldest and most experienced of the 100-odd workers there had spent years tinkering with and improving the efficiency of the giant machines used to package tea bags. Output had increased, and with them profits. Yet what did the owners do with the extra money? Did they give it to the workers a raise and reward? Did they give it the workers a raise to reward them for increased productivity? In the old Keynesian days of the 50s and 60s, they almost certainly would have. No longer. Did they hire more workers and expand production? No, again. All they did was hire middle managers. For years, he explained, there had only been two executives in the factory, the boss and the human resources officer. As profits rose, more and more men in suits appeared, until there was almost a dozen of them. The suits all had elaborate titles, but there was almost nothing for them to do. So they spent a lot of time walking the catwalks, staring at the workers, setting up metrics to measure and evaluate them, writing plans and reports. Eventually, they hit on the idea of moving the entire operation overseas. Largely, he speculated, because devising the plan created a retrospective excuse for their existence, though he added it probably didn't hurt that while the workers themselves would mostly lose their jobs, the executives who made the plan would likely be relocated to a more attractive location. Before long, the workers had seized the building, and the perimeter was swarming with riot cops.
A left critique of bureaucracy, therefore, is sorely lacking. Then he kind of goes on to apologize for the fact that he doesn't know the solution. He doesn't know even the recipe for how to come up with the proper critique. Although I think that you touched on something where this is really fitting, right? And this is what we've talked about in this podcast so far. A critique of bureaucracy fit for the times would have to show how all these threads, financialization, violence, technology, and fusion of public and private knit together into a single self-sustaining web. And I feel like that part seems pretty well wrought in this conversation. I think that is clearly comes down to the fact that the financial sector has found a way to rope everybody into it at the cost, at the threat, the point of threat of losing all their savings, right? Or not having a job, not having health care. Like there's a significant prison guard in exchange going on here, where you're spending time guarding and you're spending time as a prisoner, and so everybody is complicit in it. That seems to be the web.
And I mean, I think that the reason that web is necessary is that if you go back 100 years, maybe 200 years, I don't know, you have a condition where the family unit is still really strong, and so as you grow old, your children will take care of you. And so you don't need to have this massive nest egg of money that will support you through the twilight of your life, because your family will support you. and there's a place for you to continue to exist, and you probably will die before you really start to degrade in the absolutely dehumanizing way in which people degrade now, which is like dementia and Parkinson's and terrible cancers and all these things. Like, you died younger than you do now. And so you have an extra 20 years now where you can't really work because you're old enough that you're not really a super powerful cog in the machine. And so what you spend your entire life doing is you spend your entire life trying to preserve sufficient quantity of financial wealth to be able to propel you through that dark period where you'll be able to hire somebody who can take care of you. You'll be able to spend money in order to provision yourself.
Get those mitochondrial injections.
Get the mitochondrial injections. And so it's like, I think that ultimately that's the great crisis, where it's like when people talk about falling birth rates being a really big problem, that's what they're really pointing to. The value is the fact that we have had a system that works for a long time, which is that the bonds of blood and family are the bonds that provide you the cushion where you don't need to have massive savings. But if you don't have those bonds and you don't have somebody who will take care of you and will be the one who's on the vanguard earning the money, making the profits to protect you, you have to do it yourself. And so as we offshore that to these financial structures, like, what option remains? You either, I mean, honestly, this is going to be really grim, and I know that I feel like talking about death is like a really dark thing, but I feel like having a really good plan for how you're going to die is important for this. Because if your entire life is spent working so that you can have this reward of retirement where you can have fun, then your entire mode is organized around the protection of the nest egg and the enforcement of these bureaucratic systems which protect you. But if you are like, look, I'm going to live differently, and I'm not going to plan for having 20 years of fun at the end of my life before I go into the nursing home or whatever. And instead, like, I would love to have a plan in place where I have some way of humanely calling it when it's time. To just say that, like, okay, I've lived the way that I've wanted to for long enough. It has now become too difficult and weird to live the way that I want, and I'm going to go off to the next phase and see what's there. Because I think that
I think that
protects
death
you.
is important, but also I think that you can die a lot before you even retire. Like, I think that people become distracted by this idea that they're going to live after they retire, to the extent that their bodies are pummeled into dysfunction by the time that they even get there.
Well, like, who has the time to take care of their body if they have a job and they have children?
Right. It's tricky.
Like,
And a hobby.
yeah, your hobby has to basically be exercising at that point.
Yeah.
And that's a hard sell for a lot of people.
And even that, like, I have a really good friend whose hobby is exercising, but he just completely abuses his body all day long while he's at his job. And so it's like, I'm not going to say it's a wash, but it's still, he's going to go into retirement with a completely destroyed body.
And it's like, this is the...
But I want to say one more thing about death too, is that people in our society are increasingly unwilling to consider death as well. And this goes hand in hand with what you're saying. People spend very little time out in nature seeing death. The bodies are covered with white blankets as soon as somebody dies in public. Open casket funerals are increasingly less common. I mean, somebody told me once that the reason they have those vestibules in old houses is because they used to wheel the casket into these entry rooms. So if you go to an old, Victorian or something, you always have this little entry room. This has a name that I can't remember right now. But it was so commonplace that you would have a room for that because people are dying all the time and you're well acquainted with death. And actually, this is one thing that I think psychedelics can do a lot for people, is I think that, and probably the reason a lot of people don't like psychedelics too, is because I think they do force you to consider yourself in a bigger landscape that involves lots of life forms that are all living and dying. and to become really well acquainted with the fact that you're going to die. A lot of people experience, especially on the more intense psychedelics, like they go through this ratchet up phase where they're like, oh my God, I'm going to die, I'm going to die, I'm going to die, I'm going to die. This is going to, I'm dead. Like, especially with DMT and ayahuasca, and people are like, I literally died. But then what's funny is that once they've gone through that, they're like, wait, actually dying wasn't so bad. It wasn't so bad at all. I was able to make peace with all of these little pieces of karmic insecurity that had been lingering over me. I realized that I could let them go. And they have that experience with what it means to be a finite organism in a vast cosmic sea of other organisms. And this sense of, oh, wait, I'm just this piece. I'm one eyeball on this gazillion eyeball entity. And I think that it has a way of forcing people to deal with death in a productive outcome, which is perhaps quite unpleasant at first. It's like the Larry David smoking weed for the first time in the bathroom situation where he's like staring at himself like, I'm a piece of shit, you know? And it's funny because sometimes you meet people and you talk to them about cannabis or something and they'll be like, yeah, no, it makes me really paranoid. I don't like that stuff. And I never say it because it's kind of crass, but I want to just be like, yeah, it should make you like, that's good. That means you got junk in your in your soul arteries. Like you need to listen to that voice. Of course, there's a huge spectrum of people. People have schizophrenic tendencies. It's not good for everyone. So it's hard to say everybody should do psychedelics, man. Obviously, that's not possible, but I think for a lot of people, it can be really beneficial for unsticking them and getting them to face these things that are lingering under the surface that cause them to look towards the end of their life like it's going to be this piggy bank that they're going to just use up at some point, as opposed to being like, wait a second, I need to live all the time. I need to find a way to live and work in a way that doesn't kill me. And so I do honestly believe that the psychedelic revolution is important in the future and in the modern age. You know, whether it's, and this has been the case in other non-Western, well, actually, even if you go back to the Greeks, you go back to the Romans and the cults, right? They're starting to suspect that there was a psychedelic portion to these pilgrimages people would do. But certainly in a lot of indigenous cultures, there's a long tradition of when you come of age, you know, you go through so whether it's naturally induced through extreme exposure, intense pain, psychedelic plants, there's something where you force someone to face all of this terrible cosmic baggage and make peace with it. Because you can make peace with it, is the truth. You really can make peace with the fact that you are going to die, and that can inspire you to make the most of every single day that you're living.
But it also requires you at that point to take a look around and to be like, what is this life that I'm living now?
Right.
And I feel like we have this experience sometimes, which is, I almost am reluctant to talk about it.
It's
but
okay, just make up new names for the faces.
No, I feel this is, it's, like I feel like there's some cosmic, punishment that awaits me when I talk about this. But I'm like, we live really well. Like, I look at the way that we live our lives and we spend our time focused on questions that we're interested in. We're working on a puzzle that's really intriguing to us about, you know, how to make this podcast successful, how to engage with ideas,
how to understand the atom, how to play music better, how to make friends better.
Right? And so we spend all of our time focusing on these things that really are valuable to us. And we have a lot of friends where it's obvious
how to eat better.
Yeah, like all of these things. Like we're optimizers just by our very nature. And we've set up our life in such a way where we spend most of our time doing things that we like and figuring out how to do them better. And I am so incredibly blessed to be able to do that. And the trade-off that we have made is that we don't have very much money. And that, I think, is a really...
in comparison to almost everybody we know.
Right. Like anybody that has even...
So we spend a lot of time, all of our friends, we hang out with them, and we are the poor kids, for sure.
Yeah. And it's weird because I can see the the appeal of that, right? Like we have this friend who like Gucci sunglasses, Versace shoes, like really well dressed all the time, makes good money, but there seems to be this like deep ennui about it, where it's like there's all these other parts of his life that are disordered. And it's tragic because I'm like, I think that if you restructured your life to be poorer, to not try to aim for this massive 6-figure job that you don't really, really love anymore, and instead focused on other things, you'd probably be better off. But that's almost an impossible thing to suggest to somebody because it's dangerous. The thing that, our parents, they're terrified we're going to end up homeless. They're terrified.
Less and less so, but certainly when we quit our jobs and started down this road.
Yeah, and even now, it's like when we were talking to your parents the other day, it was like, well, you're teaching next semester and I'm not teaching. And I could tell that there's this little note of, it's a bad idea that you're not teaching.
I don't think anybody understands how little money I make teaching. It's
not
really,
even that. It's just
the bureaucratic insert, right?
Yes,
Yeah.
it's the foot in the door. There's
in
no
the
gap in
bureaucracy.
your resume. Like, what if later you decide that you want to do it full time and you're not doing it full time and it's going to be a problem? And I'm like, these are all really real considerations. And if you're not a particularly conscientious person, where you'll be able to operate outside of these systems, it probably will destroy you, because most people, I think, operate best when there's a clear project in front of them that somebody is helping them direct. And honestly, I count myself among that. Like, if I was on my own, I think I would have a much harder time succeeding on the outside than with you as a team. Because you're very conscientious, you're very driven, you're very focused on like, okay, this is the set of goals, this is how we're going to work towards them.
Prioritize and execute.
Yeah, prioritize and execute. And so it's like, I think that it's not a piece of advice that works for everybody in the position that they're in right now.
Nor is the psychedelic solution.
But yet, I think that the only possible thing that would
Although I will say people like that are the least interested in psychedelic experiences.
How could you be?
Right.
Like, you can't be interested in a psychedelic experience if in the back of your mind you know that it's going to shake apart everything that you've built and the little bubble of security that you've produced. And so I think that the only thing that will resolve this bureaucratic capture is for people to stop participating in the bureaucratic systems. But that is the hardest possible thing to do, because you have to restructure your entire life, your entire set of goals, your entire set of orientations. And I feel very tentative about offering that as a possibility for people, because I have no idea how this is going to work out for me. Like,
I don't have that same, I don't have any trepidation about it. I mean, look, I set out on this journey many, many, many years ago. I was just hell-bent since I entered the bureaucratic workforce to get out of it at all costs.
Sure.
But
I don't know that that's going to work out for me. Do you know what I mean? Like, I have also been.
But it is working out for you.
For now. And
but now it's all you have, really, is the thing.
That's true.
It will just be now later.
That's true, but somebody who works a 6-figure job and banks all that and invests it and has a big retirement fund is going to be okay for a much longer period of time.
Or they're going to just be able to hang out with their beaten down body and broken families and like I don't see it. I'm like, yeah, okay, I live really close to the wire, but I know how to get out of it too. Like, if you took away everything I own today, it's going to be a rough couple of weeks, but I'm not going to be on the street very long. Like, I know how to form relationships with people. I know how to offer. I have skills that I developed. They may seem a little not obvious, but I can organize things. I can get stuff done. I can be valuable to any situation, and I can slowly peel back until I'm back where I am today. I feel like that's a muscle you build. And if you're constantly just in a job where someone's telling you what to do, you're not strengthening that muscle at all.
And so I guess that the answer is to strengthen that muscle gradually and slowly in order to be able to do something else. But it's like, I don't think that what we do is less work than working for somebody else. In fact, I think it's
way more.
Way more, right?
Yeah.
And so that's a hard thing to suggest to people, because it's like, this is far more encompassing than any job that I've ever had before. Like at other jobs, it was like you show up, you do the thing, you leave. I never
Yeah, even
really,
at an Ivy League research institute.
right? Like I would read after work sometimes, but like my passions were elsewhere.
Even people who
always.
stay late, like in the labs, right? They leave and go to the bar afterwards and forget about it. Like that happens.
Sure. And so I'm like,
We can't do that.
no,
It's hard to catch your breath.
and that's a really hard thing because it can lead to burnout. It can lead to, you and I experience this all the time, where it's just because it's so all encompassing and it's entirely in our hands, there's this question of like, what do you aim for? How high do you aim? What is the energetic output? Like,
What is the limit on the number of projects you can take on?
and that's something that everybody has to decide for themselves. And so it's weird because Graeber critiques this like self-actualization language as being the fascism of the individual.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
And I'm like, I'm not 100% sure about that because I feel like the only way out of the bureaucratic mess is to figure out how to do something that runs either parallel to it or outside of it that is self-actualizing. Whether that's you working with a group of people to accomplish some project that you believe in, or it's you working on your own to accomplish something that you believe in, I think that that's the only possible way out. And he seems to not really buy into that. And I'm not totally sure why, but I think that it might be because of his socialist commitments, which is that the idea is the collective. The collective works together to perform an action. And so raw individualism, which says, I don't need anybody and I will help nobody, is really dangerous for those sorts of communities.
I mean, even us getting out of working in jobs still leaves us subservient to the financialization of the world. And so that systematic change needs to take a different shape. And I personally think that worker ownership can play a huge role here. In other words, if you were going to start your own bureaucracy, which you necessarily have to do, that you find a way to do it in such a way that there aren't external investors not part of the workforce. Because we've seen some incredible examples of this, where companies are more flexible in times of crisis. They're able to have zero externalities because the people who are working there are unwilling to execute on plans that will affect their environment locally. And you essentially have zero middlemen in the financing sector, especially with a place like Mondragon, where the banks are worker-owned themselves as well. So you have this network of non-external investors. Remember, it's not the investors that are a problem. It's the dissociated investing in companies that you have no business investing in.
Well, it's like gambling. It's the difference between investing in something that you have a stake in versus just betting on whether or not something will succeed and hoping that you're going to get ample returns from it.
Yeah, and just to be clear, what I mean by worker ownership is just, and this might be a very narrow definition for worker ownership, but what I mean is zero external investors. That's it. It's like you buy into the company, you invest in it, you can get your investment back when you leave. And then there's all sorts of different ways of which democracy can play out. People take turns in different board positions, treasury, all of that. These things are details that can be sorted out by the individual firm. By removing the external investors, you're no longer dependent on this dispersive financial structure to keep you afloat, that you have to bow down to this faceless entity of the stock market. And you can actually focus on what the customers need, what the workers need, what the community that is holding you up needs. And there's something really promising and beautiful about that. And I do think that if we piggyback off the self-actualization, yeah, you should work towards, if you're a plumber, you should work towards starting your own plumbing company. Honestly, like, do it. But if you do that and you start hiring people, like, consider that when you get to the point of financializing, right, before you go public, consider another alternative. Because
I don't know that there's a lot of plumbing companies on the New York Stock Exchange.
Right. But at some point, if you start off as a plumber, start off as a plumbing company, maybe you start selling parts at some point. You get a warehouse company, you become a supplier. These things can rise to the level of corporate, ballooning very quickly.
But I think that the ultimate idea here is that what will resolve this is a greater interdependence with the community, where no man, no woman is an island. And in fact, it's a team. It's teams that build things. It's teams that work together to accomplish things. And we have an almost naive American myth of, the American Prometheus, the man is an island who is able to strike out into the world and accomplish these things all by themselves.
Rough and ready.
Yeah. And I don't think that that's the way out. I think that that is the way to a really unstable and terrifying existence. I think that deeply meshing yourself into a network of people, a community that is supporting you, that you are supporting, is the only way out of this. Where it is not individuals, it is individuals in communion with one another. Because we belong in an ecosystem. Like, we talked about this the first time we tried to record this conversation. We came down to the fact that the language of ecology is the language that is necessary for this critique. Because when you have a parasitic entity that is overtaking the entire environment, you have to come up with A, defenses against that parasitic entity, and B, structures that are more successful than whatever structure is being preyed upon by the parasite. And so it's like...
So the proliferation of multiple smaller entities and collaborations is a potential path forward.
Team consciousness.
This is like a healthy ecosystem versus a replicator ecosystem.
Yeah, like the multitude of possibilities, the minds of each person being applied to figuring out how to do something differently, rather than this like really weird, algorithmically fueled attempt to rise to the peak of some pre-existing pyramid.
It's interesting because this kind of thing can actually be legislated, right, at the local level. Our friend who's an engineer was telling us about his firm working with the different transit authorities and how the voters had essentially demanded that some portion of the transit budget, when it comes to repairs and maintenance and all of this, go to small, what do you call it, one shingle shop? Or I don't remember the term. Basically, individual mom and pop proprietor engineering firms. To the extent that when they did this, I forget what huge job they had recently done with the BART system, but there was something like 30 different independent engineer, the geo guy and the water tables guy. They're all these one-man shops that could, just like the huge firm he works for now, it started off as one of those with just a single guy. And he got one of those grants. He was able to hire some more people to help him out. And eventually he turns into one of the big fish too. But that kind of realizing that healthy ecosystem is inherently valuable and that having these giant monopolies is actually not good for quality of work and it's not good for cost of work. And realizing that and baking it into the actual plans when it comes to these civic projects is actually quite brilliant.
Yeah, and I mean, to further the ecology metaphor, it's like in an old growth forest, you're going to get a lot of really, really, really big trees. That's going to be what happens. And yet, there are fires that pass through that clear the underbrush and allow new trees to come up and take over from the old ones once they die. When a tree does die, it turns into a mother tree. You see this all the time in the woods in the Pacific Northwest.
I love this.
When the tree falls, the seeds from the trees up above fall into it. And so you have this really fertile ground from which sprout all of the new trees that will replace the one that has fallen. And so it's like...
One of my favorite sites, what was that place we used to go hiking at?
Larch Mountain.
Larch Mountain, yeah. There's just this big, big old fallen kind of rotting tree and then just 12, a dozen or so little trees just growing all along it in a line, like a perfect line as if they were planted. It's so beautiful.
Which is why...
Tree of trees.
The tree of trees, which is why to me it feels like death is such an important part of this, because as we race towards the technological singularity, I think all of these entrenched systems will become much worse rather than much better. We're at this point where it seems inevitable that culture will solidify and freeze into the systems that we have right now, because the only voices that really are revolutionary are young voices. Because they look out onto the landscape and they're like, this is bullshit. Why are we doing it this way? And the people that are old are just kind of like, well, it worked for me. And so if you have a deathless...
So everybody hates boomers.
Yeah, and it's like if you have a deathless society, then the young never can challenge it. And so if you have... What I see happening is I'm like, okay, birth rates fall, mechanization increases, lifespans also increase. And so you have frozen society because nothing new is coming up. The machines can only feed off of what has already been. Like, I have a feeling that the training data for machines is going to be forced to stop at like 2022, because that's when they start to produce all of this engineered content, and that content is kind of garbagey. And so it's like, okay,
Start being self-referential.
And you can't, and the machines can't self-reference themselves, and so because model collapse, and so you have to basically say, okay, well, the only thing that we can feed into the machines is the pristine content that was produced before this point. And if you can never produce new content because the only ideas that are coming from the machines, because there's no young people, it just seems to create a terrible catastrophe. And so I'm like, there has to be something about death and rebirth in this system that's baked into it, because otherwise I think it can't work.
And institutional lifespan, like we were talking about with Jim Keller, it feeds right into that.
Yeah. So I don't know, let's go figure it out. Let's go see what it looks like. We're always kind of aiming at this. We're always trying to figure out better ways to do it.
Yeah. And I think we put our finger on the problem, at least, which was kind of the goal for this. And we've come up with some language for talking about it, which is useful. The solution set is very half-baked at this point, but I think we're only going to find solutions by talking to more and more people. I'm kind of excited for our next conversation with Simon Michaud.
The Utopians.
That was one of the few, whether you like his solution set or not, he's at least working. That seems to be a focus is, well, how could this be different? And so we're having another conversation with him next week soon. And I look forward to more of that kind of thing because, now that we know what's up, we got to figure out what to do about it.
It would be really interesting, actually, to do a survey of these utopian alternative communities, because they come in all shapes and sizes, from like the libertarian sea cities to the socialist.
Yeah, we should talk to some of those people.
Let's do that.
All right.
Let's do it.
Bye, everybody.